Weakness, spasticity, and an abnormal synergy pattern. If you've suffered damage to your brain or your spinal cord, and you have a tendency to lean to one side, there is a high likelihood that all three of those things are going on simultaneously. So I talked a little bit about this in last week's video, with many of you asking for exercises specific to these three problems and how they are impacting your walking, specifically causing you to lean to one side. So I thought I would do a part 2 to last week's video and go over more exercises that can help you if you are someone that has a tendency to lean to one side when you walk. If you're new to this channel, I'm Tara. I'm a neurologic physical therapist, and on this channel you will find anything and everything related to neurologic rehabilitation with the mission to empower you to feel a little bit more in control of your rehab program. And with all that being said, as I mentioned, today we are going to specifically focus on exercises working out of an extensor synergy pattern. As I talked about last week, that is one problem that can cause you to lean away from your involved side, as well as a couple more exercises on just strengthening those hip abductors, because as I mentioned last week as well, many times the hip abductors are weak. And then also how you manage or control spasticity or involuntary movement of the muscles that point the foot down while you're doing these exercises, so that you are training your body specifically to be able to walk with less involuntary pointing of the foot, less abnormal extensor synergy, and higher quality movement. So first and foremost, let's go over what an extensor synergy is, because it's going to make the out of synergy exercises make a lot more sense. So as I mentioned, if you have a tendency to lean to the side when you walk, there is a good chance that you are going into an extensor synergy pattern when you are standing on your involved leg. An abnormal synergy pattern in general is when multiple joints link together. So muscles that move joints link together. And in this case, the hip will extend, the knee will extend or straighten out, and the foot points all at the same time. And that is not an ideal situation for when you are standing on your involved leg. So what do we need to do? We need to learn how to move out of synergy. And so for this specific issue, for those of you that your extensor synergy is causing you to lean to the side when you stand on your involved leg, you want to work on isolating knee extension, because your leg is straight when you are standing on it, without the foot pointing, because as I mentioned last week, foot pointing will push you backwards, throwing that hip out to the side, which may give the appearance that you are leaning to the side. And work on hip abduction, so moving that leg out to the side without the knee extending. So that's a tricky one because it's hard to see when you're walking, and it's actually really hard for a lot of therapists to pick up on. They will immediately assume, or most therapists will immediately assume, that if you have a hip drop, meaning your uninvolved side hip drops when you're standing on your involved leg, that means that you have weakness in the muscles on the outside of the hip because they can't hold your hips straight. But if you've had damage to your brain or your spinal cord, in most cases, I have found that if I actually get someone on the mat and I test this, it's really that you're going into an extensor synergy pattern, and when your knee is extending, your hip is adducting, or your legs are coming together. So we need to break up that pattern. So we need to work hip abduction with your knee bent. So just trust me on this, because that component is a little bit confusing, but just be aware that the exercises we're going to go over today, that is the rationale behind some of the exercises that we're going to be doing. And then the other part of that abnormal synergy pattern that you want to break up is you want to extend the knee without letting the foot point. So this is where abnormal synergy and spasticity are kind of meeting together, coming together, and creating a bigger explosion or a bigger fire. They're two separate problems, but yes, they do occur at the same time and create a bigger problem when it comes to standing on that leg. So what we need to do, whether it's because you have spasticity in your ankle and you're getting involuntary pointing when you're standing on that leg, or your foot is pointing because you are demonstrating or you have an abnormal synergy pattern, which can also happen when you're standing on that leg because that knee is straightening out, so the foot's going to want to point. In either case, we don't want the foot pointing when you're standing on it. So whether it's because of spasticity or an abnormal synergy pattern, one good exercise to do is you need to relearn how to straighten your leg out without your ankle pointing. And then the other component of this that some of you asked for exercises last week, because I really only gave one exercise, and a lot of you said that you can't do that exercise. So the third component to stop a posture from leaning is to work the muscles that abduct the hip. Just straight up muscles on the outside of the hip. Move that leg out to the side. Can be helpful. I'm going to show a few more exercises today at each stage. So regardless of where you are at in the recovery process, you will find something that you can apply today to start strengthening the outside of that hip. So again, this is a part 2 to last week's video where I talked about a leaning posture. I have linked that video in the description below. I highly recommend that you go and watch that video because it is going to make this one make a whole lot more sense. But I'm adding on to that to help you to keep your body more vertical when you are walking and to prevent your trunk or your upper body from leaning to one side. We are going to do that by working out of synergy in the 2 ways I just talked about. Relearn how to keep the ankle flexed and practice standing without the foot pointing. If you can master all of those, there's a good chance you're gonna have less muscles pushing you backwards, which is one reason I talked about last week that you might lean to the side, as well as keeping that bottom in, not letting that bottom pop out to the side when you're standing on your involved leg, and not letting the opposite hip drop. So this is isolated hip abduction. Really critical in the early stages. We call this gravity eliminated. So because you're going parallel to the ground, that makes it gravity eliminated. Now, the key to this one, a lot of times people will rotate their knee out to the side and really use their hip flexors to move that leg out to the side. The trick to this one is making sure that your knee stays pointed up to the ceiling. If you are a caregiver that's helping someone with this activity, maybe do it with their AFO on, and you can almost kind of hold their foot up when they have their AFO on to help keep that knee pointed up as they move that leg out to the side. So again, gravity eliminated, moving that leg out to the side, not letting it roll out. Then when it rolls out like that and it goes out, then you're primarily using your hip flexors to do that movement. So making sure your knee is pointed up towards the ceiling the whole time. So this is hip abduction against gravity. Very hard to do this, but extremely important, especially when you're learning how to stand on that leg. Your hip abductors are what keep your hips level when you remove one of the pillars that are holding your hips level. So when you shift your weight onto one leg and you're only standing on one leg, it's really those muscles on the outside of the hip that keeps your hips level. So super important exercise. Now the trick to this one is to make sure that you're not rolling onto your back or you're not rotating your legs so that your knee is pointed up to the ceiling. Then you're compensating a little bit more with your hip flexors. So to really isolate those hip abductors, you want to almost think about leading with your heel when you lift that leg and not rolling onto your back. So those are the 2 critical things to think about when you do this exercise. So almost have the heel leading the way. You can see my heel is higher than the rest of my foot. If you roll onto your back and you start to do it like this, then you're using more of your hip flexors. So really making sure that you stay on your side when you lift that leg. So this is a hip abduction exercise in tall kneeling. Now the benefit of doing hip abduction, or working those muscles that move that leg out to the side in tall kneeling, is it takes you out of an extensor synergy pattern and really further helps you to just isolate those muscles that move that leg out to the side. Now for this exercise, I would do it on both sides. So if you have hemiparesis and one side is weaker than the other, I would do it moving the weaker leg out to the side, but also working the stronger leg, or working that stronger leg out to the side. In both cases, you are working the muscles that move the leg out to the side on the other leg. So again, do this both ways. Now always start with your foot on the mat or staying down. That's the easier method. That'll help you just kind of learn how to feel that movement a little bit, and then progress to lifting the whole leg up off of the bed, including the foot. So again, this is the easier version, keeping that foot down when you bring that knee out to the side. Again, that's the easier version. And again, also you want to do this on both sides. So when you're on the weaker leg and you're moving the other leg out to the side, it really takes a lot of strength in those hip abductors to stabilize yourself. So again, do this on both sides. The key when you're doing your uninvolved leg is to make sure your belly button gets somewhat lined up right over your knee, so that your center of mass, your center of gravity, is directly over that knee, and move that leg out to the side. Again, starting with the foot down and then progressing to lifting the whole leg up. It's a lot harder to do it that way. So this is what we call a fire hydrant in quadruped. So that's when you're on your hands and your knees. This is really hard for any of you that have a lot of arm involvement. But for anyone that has full strength in their arms, if you really want to isolate those hip abductors, so the muscles that move your leg out to the side, while also learning how to keep your core tight, this is a good position to do that in. So the trick is to keep your core really tight, so really work on, or think about, trying to keep your abdominals tucked in, your belly button kind of pushing up towards the ceiling, and just isolating those hip abductors and external rotators. So again, abdominals tight, spine neutral, not overly rounded up and not sinking down, but just neutral. The easier way to do this is to keep your foot on the mat. And then when you get a little bit more advanced, you can lift the whole leg. So this is basically just an ankle dorsiflexion stretch. So you want to take a wedge and put the wider section underneath your toes. And the key to this one is making sure that you're pushing your hips forward. A lot of times when people put this wedge under their foot, their bottom will drift back and they're not really getting a good stretch at the ankle. So when you do have that wedge underneath there, you just want to make sure you tuck that bottom in, and you should feel the stretch along the back side of your lower leg. And then you just hold it. You always want to keep a little bit of bend in your knee, so try not to lock that knee all the way out. And then if you wanted to challenge yourself a little bit more, just step the other leg just a little bit further forward, and that'll just deepen that stretch. I hope all of that made sense. I hope you guys can put at least a few of those exercises into use. Now, last week's video is super important. You have to practice specifically, and you have to learn good habits that you can eventually carry over into walking. So that little scaffolding trick I showed in last week's video to keep your body upright and work on some of those pre-gait activities I talked about last week, super, super important. I would consider these like preparatory exercises, so maybe incorporate some of these videos that I just went over first to kind of get that brain warmed up and feeling what you want it to do when you stand up, and then go into those loading and unloading exercises. And then that is it for this video. Again, I hope all of that made sense. If you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell so that you will get notified every time I upload a new video. I enjoyed spending time with you all today, and I will see you in the next video.